Hello, my name is Tehmina Goskar and I am the Headley Fellow here at the Museum of Cornish Life. That means I'm here researching the collections and finding out more about their past and history and how they got here. Today I'm introducing you and giving you a bit of a tour of our latest exhibition called Dolls. The dolls have all come from our own collections here at the museum. And while we're redisplaying all of our toys, dolls and games, we thought it would be really interesting to explore the history of dolls and why people find them so interesting, so creepy, or really are very indifferent to them. We've got different sections in this exhibition that explore dolls through different stories and through different topics. One of the quotes that first inspired me to think about dolls differently came from a children's book by Rama Godden called The Doll's House, which was published in 1947. In it, it says, "It is an anxious, sometimes a dangerous thing to be a doll. Dolls cannot choose, they can only be chosen. They cannot do, they can only be done by." And in this story, dolls that end up in museums also feature, which also then made us think about why we ended up with so many dolls in our collection. Most of them represent female figures of some form or another. And that was something that was researched further by one of our volunteers, Iona Teitler, who is based up in Glasgow and studies gender studies and wonders about what it is about dolls, particularly when they are in a museum context, that make them so interesting. The idea behind that is that when dolls enter museums, they stop becoming playthings, they stop being seen as playthings, but rather they're read as texts. So they are always considered to be some reflection or other of social and cultural attitudes. And these are quite complex attitudes, and very many people have very differing views of them. So we thought we would use this notion that dolls are manifestations of an idea, a pastiche of an idea. They're never meant to represent someone exactly or a kind of person exactly. They are someone else's idea of other people or a fantasy figure. And we have many of these across our collections. One of the more interesting range of dolls that many of you may be familiar with are the national costume souvenir dolls. These dolls are dressed in what are sometimes outlandish and sometimes entirely made up national dress. And we wonder why it is that when you go on holiday, particularly from here in the UK or perhaps in other parts of Europe, these dolls are made for the tourist market to take home an idea of what that culture of that nationality might be like, even though it's so far removed from reality. And we have a particularly extensive collection of national costume dolls from Mrs. Orchard's collection, which was donated to the museum some years ago. Another way that we can think about these stereotypes that dolls represent, particularly in things like souvenirs, is actually to look a bit closer to home. And we also have a lovely collection of Cornish dolls, and we explore the idea of Cornish dolls through the idea of whether they're icons or stereotypes. So when does a stereotype become an icon, and when does an icon become a stereotype? And those of you who are Cornish and who are familiar with Cornish life and culture will probably immediately recognise some of these dolls and what they represent. But they may not necessarily be an accurate view of people living their Cornish life, which is what this museum is all about. So we have, for example, a pasty seller, we have a clotted cream maker, we have a fisherman, a bal maiden, a fishwife, an apple seller, many characters, I guess, that represent the important industries of the day, both in the past, but actually still today. Then we have some more fantasy-like figures like the pirate. The features of a pirate are so interesting. No one will ever have seen one in real life in the past or now, and yet we have a really powerful view of what a pirate should look like. And the media and film and TV, comic books and children's books are also responsible for creating those kinds of characters. Also among the Cornish dolls, we have some specific figures that are important in Cornish history. One being, for example, the fishwife from Mounts Bay in West Cornwall, Mary Kleinak, who was well known in the 19th century for having walked on foot all the way from Land's End to London to visit the Great Exhibition, and also allegedly she met Queen Victoria when she was up there. Another character is John Wesley, the Methodist preacher, whose philosophies were very influential in Cornwall and very influential in converting much of the population to Methodism. And we have him here represented holding a teapot because he was also teetotal and promoted a temperate lifestyle and discouraged the drinking of alcohol. But also among these, we have perhaps some more interesting figures. And one of the ones I find most interesting is the figure of someone called Mary Wedlock. She was a woman from Curie who was well known as a mill worker who dressed in menswear while she did her work at the mill. And yet we have a doll that is apparently representing her in her Sunday best. And when she's depicted in her Sunday best, she's depicted with a dress, a pinafore, apron, a shawl, and a bonnet. So very unlike the dress she would have worn at work, which was much more akin to her male worker colleagues. And we are thinking that we might make ourselves a doll that we imagine Mary Wedlock to have looked like when she worked at the mill. Among the other kinds of dolls we have that represent characters are historic costume dolls. And we have a wonderful collection here from what we call the Jeb collection, where all of the dolls' costumes have been historically researched and are relatively accurate. So unlike the National Costume Dolls, we have here the potential for dolls to also represent something that is historically accurate. And among these dolls, you will find particularly the dress of particular queens and noble women through time who were the richest in their society and therefore were able to afford the best and most elaborate clothes. And we also have in amongst these a doll of Mary, Queen of Scots, who very unfortunately was executed and lost her head. And that is how we present her here. One of my particular highlights while putting this exhibition together was corresponding with a fabulous curator from America called Debbie Bean Garrett. And she is an international expert and historian specifically of black dolls. So these are dolls that represent the diversity of black people all across the world in society, and she collects them, she researches them, and she publishes them. And do visit her online museum, the Virtual Black Doll Museum. In our collection here at the Museum of Cornish Life, we have two particular black dolls that are very intriguing. One was made in the 1950s and it was made in England. And the other one, we still need to do a bit more research, but he is our poster boy. So this boy doll was made probably in the 1930s in Germany and is a particularly interesting and rare kind of black doll. The reason we have ended up with them in our collection is because the curators at the time, back in the very early 1990s, noticed them in a shop in Falmouth called Rosina's Toy Shop. And they said that they saw them in the window. They were developing a toy shop display here at the museum and they just fell in love with them. So together with a white doll who wears a yellow dress, these three dolls came into the museum and are now really important parts. And And the interesting thing specifically about black dolls and their history is that it's actually quite different from what you may consider dolls that represent racially offensive stereotypes, for example, or caricatures. By those, I mean dolls like gollywogs and pickaninny dolls, which in recent years especially have attracted a lot of criticism, controversy, and a lot of debate and argument, particularly online. For example, should they be displayed? Should museums still have them? What should happen to them? But as a museum, we feel really strongly that what we want to do is share the history of everything that we have and what they represent in society then and now. So what we have done with our display and our interpretation of why the gollywog character developed is to go right back to the roots. And we're really fortunate to have a copy here of Florence Upton's illustrated book called The Adventures of Two Dutch Dolls. So we go right to the roots of this character, trace its link to black and white minstrelsy, which originated in America, and that involved white men blacking up their faces, wearing very exaggerated costume, and essentially satirizing black American music and dance. That absolutely had a very negative effect on society's view of black people and their culture, not just in America, but also here in Britain. People may not realise now just how popular black and white minstrelsy was. And again, drawing on our music collection, we found a magazine that went with one of the millions of recordings that came out of black and white minstrels, songs and tunes. Their shows were sellouts, and the American acts were even copied by British and Cornish bands. And we even had our own minstrel band here called the Hale Christie's Minstrels. And we're able to draw on all of this history to give a bit more context to why the gollywog character in particular became popular, but also how it ended up having this negative effect specifically on black British people. So we want to show this history in all of its detail in order for our visitors and watchers to make up their own minds about what they think should happen to the dolls, and of course the words that represent them that are also considered by many to be outmoded, outdated and offensive. In amongst all of these, we have some really special dolls, and so I want to end this little tour by telling you about my particular favourite one. And she is a doll called Salvina. She is a hand-stitched, hand-sewn doll of an Indian woman wearing a pink sari, and she is sitting in a rocking chair. And in her hand, she holds a note that has her name Salvina on top. She then has her name written in 3 different Indian languages, in Hindi, in Bengali, and in Urdu. And then the note goes on to say that this doll was sewn to demonstrate the skills of a teacher who was doing her teacher training course in the Baptist mission in Patna in India. And this person was a Helston woman. Very unfortunately, we don't know her name. And again, this exhibition has given us the opportunity to actually continue a lot of research, particularly into the international and global connections that our collections represent. So the Salvina doll was made in India by a Helston woman. She wears this beautiful sari, which is actually worn in the correct way. So unlike the national costume dresses, actually, again, this is an authentic and faithful representation. Who the doll represents, again, we don't know. But she has such a special story, and she has a name, which is always wonderful when you're researching any kind of object, when it has a name, when it has a provenance, a story behind it. So while I started off being actually quite indifferent to the topic of dolls and thinking, well, how do we make something interesting out of these? I've now ended thinking actually dolls can tell us more about our attitudes and society's changing attitudes than perhaps I previously thought. And that's why we're very, very pleased to have these dolls in our collection. They will also be featuring after this in a brand new display of our toy shop, where we will try and make many of the toys and games much more accessible than they currently are. We'll provide a lot more interpretation, and we really look forward to welcoming you here at the museum very soon.